are sitting in the Gospel of Matthew for a little while. We've had a series of weeks, 3 weeks on parables that Jesus told, and then this is our third week on different miracles that Jesus did. And today in our sermon, I'm going to invite us into some philosophical questioning. And that's not always comfortable, because it's really nice if we can come to church and if we can have an A, B, C, and here are the answers and here's how it goes, and we can have that solid, clear, knowledge and feel confident in that. But today I'm more inviting us into, as I tend to do, inviting us into the questions and letting us sit with the questions. So some questions that I want us to contemplate and think about, but as we do, I wonder when you approach philosophical questions, when you start thinking about things and wondering how you explain them, what's the story and the narrative you give to explain it, I wonder what things you hold firmly, and you say, no, this is true, and I hold this firmly, and which you hold lightly, and which you're happy to be unsure about and sit in the question. So as we explore these things, I want you to hold that idea. What do I hold on to firmly, and what is it okay for me to sit lightly with? I'm curious, when stuff happens in life, when you think, okay, this is the way it's going to go, I feel such a clear sense of this direction, I feel a confidence that this is what God wants me to do with my life, that this is the path I should travel, and then it does not look like that. It doesn't work out the way that you think it should, or you think it will, or you think that God is leading you into. When you look back retrospectively at what's happened, I wonder how you explain that. Do you say, oh, well, God's will was done. I thought God's will was this, but actually what happened was what God wanted to happen. Or do you think that maybe God's will was this over here, and I ended up choosing a different way, and I went against God's will? Or maybe I was forced to follow a path that I didn't want to follow because of what other people did, and God's will wasn't fulfilled. How do we explain the things that happen in life and how God is at work and what God is doing? Another philosophical question for you. Does God ever change God's mind? It's just a thought. Don't need you to answer. Just have a think about it. Does God ever change God's mind? Or is the fact that God is perfect mean that God doesn't ever change God's mind? And therefore, why do we pray? Are we trying to pray to change God's mind? To change the will of God? To change what God does? I'm holding these questions in the ether as we explore this passage today, because in this passage, it certainly feels like Jesus changes his mind. And how do we sit with that, with the concept of Jesus' perfection and Jesus' identity as the Son of God? How do we sit with that, with the idea that Jesus changes his mind? So as we dive into this reading, I really want to give us some context of where it's coming from. And to do that, I want to rewind a little bit, because we know that we're in the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew is very much written as a Jewish piece of teaching to teach people who are Jewish about who Jesus is, that Jesus is the new Moses, and to look at how he's fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament, and that's repeated throughout the Gospel. And so for us to understand this, we need to hold in mind that way back in Genesis 12, verse 3, God gives Abram at the time, a very clear message about the purpose of God's people. God calls God's people, Israel, to know who God is, to have the first and fullest revelation of God at the time, to be taught about who God is so that they can follow and live as God's people. And God says, I will bless you, and you will be a blessing to all nations. So God chooses these select people to be a blessing to all nations, that God may be eventually known by all nations. But there's this thing about God's people in the Old Testament, that they are chosen and they are set apart. They are holy, they are different to the people around them, and God is showing them what it is to be different and what it is to worship the God who made the sun and the moons, not to worship the sun and the moon, but to worship the God who created the sun and moon. So God's showing them a different way of being. And when we get to the New Testament, when we get to Jesus, Jesus is born as a Jew amongst Jewish people, and he is called to continue that ministry to the Jewish people. And it begins as a particular ministry to those particular people. Jesus goes into areas that are the Jewish areas and speaks to people, and we have all of these references throughout the Gospel of Matthew of these fulfillment of the Old Testament. Even a couple of weeks ago, in the feeding of the 5,000, we're told in this version of the telling of that story that there were 12 baskets left over. And all of those numbers are always symbolic. Why 12 baskets? Because there are 12 tribes of Israel. So this is a feeding of God's people, God's tribe, God's chosen people of Israel throughout the Old Testament. And now here, for the first time, I don't know about you, but when you hear the Bible readings and you hear that Jesus traveled to this region and that region, does it just go in one ear and out the other? It means nothing to me, right? I've never been to that region. I don't know the areas. And so it's only when we stop and think, oh, the region that we're told he goes to here for the first time is a non-Jewish area. And he goes into this non-Jewish region for the first time. And in this gospel, we have the first account of having a conversation with a non-Jewish person, a Canaanite woman. This is a woman who's not Jewish, has no voice, no power, no right to come up to a male Jewish rabbi, but is desperate for her daughter to be healed. And she comes up to Jesus boldly and pleads for her daughter to be healed. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty shocked when I read Jesus' response. It does not sit well with me. Jesus is silent in response. Doesn't outright say, no, I am not healing your daughter, but doesn't even really engage with her, ignores her. And the disciples are annoyed and they're dismissive of her. They want her to be sent away. It's not a very comfortable response, is it, of this loving Christ that we know and follow? How do we make sense of this? And then in response to that, this woman lays down before him, kneels before him in this position of worship. She acknowledges Jesus as a descendant of David. She calls him Lord. In our inclusive translation, that's translated rabbi as teacher, which is also what he was. It's an acknowledgement of his Jewish teaching and authority. And she doesn't just ask, please can you? She's pleading with him. She persists and she persists and she persists. Not for her own sake, but for her daughter. And then Jesus appears to blatantly change his mind. He declares she has great faith, answers her prayer, and heals her daughter. What do we make of this? How do we explain this, that Jesus has changed his mind in the face of a woman who is not Jewish, who has kind of butted in and made herself annoying in a persistent request, who is other to Jesus in so many ways, and yet she changes his mind? Once again, I wonder, is this the miracle of the story? Jesus seemingly ignores her and denies her request and then turns around and says, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And it's almost insulting how he speaks to her. When he says, it isn't right to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Is he saying this woman is a dog? Saying her people are dogs? That he's come to speak and to give this blessing to the Jewish people, and they're the ones who rightfully sit at the table, and the children. I'm not going to throw this away on people who don't matter. We remember the Old Testament context that Jesus was coming from this mission of God's people. He doesn't change his mind to say, oh, you're not really valued. You're not important. Oh, okay, now you are important. I see you are valuable and you are important. Jesus is changing his mind to say, this is my mission. This is what I'm here to do. But now I will start to do this as well. Jesus was always going to bring a message of love and grace for all people. Jesus was always going to be a blessing to all nations. But at the start of the Gospel of Matthew, we see that Jesus has this sense of being called in a ministry and mission to the Jewish people. He talks of sending the disciples to the lost sheep of Israel. That's what he feels he is called to minister to, the lost sheep of Israel, as we hear in this passage. And he does things like does miracles and asks people to keep it a secret. It's this quiet, private reality of who Jesus is as a Messiah for the Jewish people. By the time we get to the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 28, the Great Commission, we know that Jesus sends his disciples to baptize all people, to be a blessing to all nations, to go into all the world, to declare God's love and grace. But something shifts between this early, I'm sent to the lost sheep, and this is my mission to God's people, and to the end of Matthew, this is a blessing for all people. Something shifts here in this encounter with this woman. Maybe she calls it into being sooner than expected, than planned, than what Jesus had thought. Maybe this was God's will all along, that this woman would be part of this process. I'm not sure. What story do we tell? What narrative, what meaning do we put to it? This woman changes Jesus' ministry and changes his direction. And she does it through persistence. She doesn't give up. She asks again and again. She's risky, she's bold, she's courageous, she's clever. She plays with the words that Jesus uses. She switches the language around. And then Jesus declares, you have great faith. Remember what he said to Peter last week when Peter stepped out of the boat? Courageously, full of faith, stepped out of the boat to walk on water with Jesus, and then got afraid because the waves were so big and it was ridiculous what he was doing. He gets afraid and Jesus saves him. And Jesus said to Peter, you have such little faith. And now he says to this woman, who's a Canaanite, who probably has no education, has no declaration of who Jesus is, doesn't say some sinner's prayer, doesn't have some theological, intellectual understanding of who Jesus is, who simply prays persistently and boldly and riskily and cares deeply for her daughter, bows down before Jesus, and Jesus says, you have great faith. Maybe Jesus is seeing something in her that no one else could see. Maybe it was just simply her persistence. But Jesus declares her faith is great. And so he heals her daughter. I have known many people of great faith, much greater faith than mine, who have prayed and prayed and persisted and have not received healing for themselves or for ones they've loved. What do we do with this? It would be really nice if we could read all of these parables and all of these miracles and say, oh, well, this happened, therefore this will always happen. It would be great if we could say, oh, every time I come to Jesus with my scarcity, Christ will bring abundance. Every time I'm afraid but step out in faith, Christ will rescue me from the waves. Every time I pray and I pray and I persist and I persist, my prayer will be answered. Every time I pray for healing with faith, there will be healing. It would be so nice if we could say, when ABC, then XYZ. But we know that that doesn't happen. We know that life doesn't work that way. So what do we do with that? I come back to these questions. How do we explain this? What do we do with these stories of miracles, with these teachings from Jesus, with these truths about who God is and the reality of our lives that don't always go like that? How do we explain it? And so much damage has been done and continues to be done when people say, well, this woman had great faith and she received healing. If you're not receiving healing, then you don't have great enough faith. How do we get from that to that? It's so damaging, so dangerous to say that if you have enough faith, Jesus will heal, because we know that that's simply not true. So how do we interpret these stories? How do we respond? How do we cope with Jesus seemingly changing his mind? Do we say that he was actually just pretending and putting on a show, testing her in some way, or he was always going to heal her? Or do we believe he genuinely changed his mind because of how she interacted with him? And how does that feel? Is that really challenging, or are we okay with that? Do we believe that if we have persistent faith, Jesus will heal? Sometimes. Good answer. Do we believe God answers our prayers and God hears us when we ask? And it matters if we ask again and again and again, or we only need to ask once? What do we believe about that? What are the answers that we find? I'm not here to give complete answers. I'm here to invite you on the journey of asking these questions. I think at the core, the Gospel of Matthew is asking us two really important questions. Who do you say Jesus is, and how will you respond to that? And we're going to explore that more over the coming 2 weeks. But I want to hold a little bit with you, share a little bit with you of what I hold firmly and what I hold lightly. In the invitation for you to explore, what do you hold firmly and what do you hold lightly? For me, I hold really firmly the knowledge that God can heal. I hold firmly that God cares for us and loves us and has deep compassion for us and provides for us and blesses us. These things I hold firmly. The things I hold lightly is when God does that, and how God does that, and why God does that. I believe that yes, sometimes God can and does heal. I don't believe that God does that because of how much faith we have. I don't believe it's a measure of, like a fundraising tally. You've got to have a little bit more faith. Oh yes, you've got enough faith. There you go, you can be healed now. I believe that God's healing is a reflection of God's grace and not a reflection of our own faith. And so yes, I pray, and I pray with strong hope and very gentle expectations. And I come back to the humble reality that I am so very finite and my God is infinite. And so I will keep coming back to God and saying, I don't understand, but please, Lord, please, God, please may your healing come. So let's sit in the questions together. Let's sit in the questions of God's love and God's grace and God's healing powers. Let's consider what we can hold firmly and what we hold lightly. And may we journey together in the midst of these questions. Amen.